In late February 2026, the direct military escalation between the United States, Israel, and Iran triggered a physical shock that moved instantly through the global macroeconomic system. The immediate retaliatory consequence was an effective blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Commercial maritime transit through this narrow corridor collapsed from an average of 150 to 175 vessels per day, down to a mere 8 to 10. The infrastructural degradation hit regional output immediately. Within weeks, Gulf crude oil production plummeted by 10 million barrels. Simultaneously, targeted strikes on Qatari hubs forced Qatar Energy to declare force majeure, removing the world's second-largest LNG exporter from the market. Prior to the strikes, the Brent crude benchmark operated with relative stability near $60 a barrel. As the supply deficit materialized, hydrocarbons violently repriced, driving the benchmark to $119.50 and injecting a heavy geopolitical risk premium into energy costs. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is a systemic constriction of the global supply chain. By shutting down this specific maritime artery, the conflict severed access to approximately 20% of worldwide petroleum consumption. While crude oil dominates the financial headlines, a lagging, deeply corrosive secondary crisis is gestating. Modern global food security relies on a steady supply of hydrocarbons. The Haber-Bosch process synthesizes ammonia for nitrogen-based fertilizers, relying entirely on natural gas as a chemical feedstock. Zooming out, Middle Eastern nations produce up to 40% of these internationally traded fertilizers. The Strait of Hormuz blockade instantly severed this critical agricultural supply chain. This disruption arrived precisely at the onset of the Northern Hemisphere's spring planting season. Because the international community maintains no strategic reserves for nitrogen fertilizer, the immediate shortage translates to reduced application rates by farmers, guaranteeing depressed crop yields globally. The United Nations World Food Programme projects that if this blockade persists beyond mid-2026, the combination of fractured supply chains and surging transportation costs will thrust an additional 45 million people into acute hunger. The physical dependency of industrial agriculture on hydrocarbon feedstocks means that a supply shock in the Gulf translates directly into a structural deficit in staple crops by the next harvest. This matrix maps how a $120 oil spike forces an involuntary wealth transfer. Capital rapidly reallocates to net energy exporting economies. The bottom left quadrant reveals the most vulnerable, heavily indebted nations across Asia and North Africa, completely dependent on imported fuel. In Pakistan, the external price shock triggered an immediate loss of investor confidence. The Pakistan Stock Exchange plunged 9.57% in a single trading session, visualizing the rapid onset of a sovereign debt crisis. In India, the crisis manifests through physical constraints. With 90% of its liquefied petroleum gas imported from the Middle East, the stranding of LPG tankers forced the government to mandate severe industrial rationing in a desperate bid to preserve cooking fuels for households. Conversely, nations like the United States and Norway occupy the net beneficiary position. Shielded by massive domestic production, they are capturing the capital fleeing from vulnerable markets, securing enormous fiscal windfalls through surging valuations for their crude and natural gas exports. China absorbs the shock through a highly engineered defense. Beijing deploys vast, opaque strategic reserves while relying on the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, a Chinese alternative to the Western SWIFT network, to settle transactions outside dollar jurisdiction, keeping its industrial base running. A nation's domestic energy production capabilities and the strength of its currency dictate whether it experiences a geopolitical blockade as an economic windfall or an existential threat. To survive the massive outward flow of capital, policymakers facing severe energy deficits are abandoning orthodox economic management in favor of radical state interventions. Developing nations without the capital to subsidize $110 oil must engineer physical demand destruction. Sri Lanka implemented a mandatory 4-day workweek and restricted motorists to just 15 liters of fuel per week, prioritizing the preservation of foreign currency reserves over domestic economic productivity. European economies possess the fiscal space to avoid outright physical rationing, allowing them to attempt complex market manipulations. This diagram outlines the European marginal pricing system. The most expensive input, currently natural gas, sets the clearing price. To depress this, Italy legally stripped mandatory carbon permits out of the pricing formula, forcing regional power prices down by 15%. The United Kingdom took a divergent path. The British government refused broad tax cuts at the pump. Instead, it deployed targeted support for off-grid households, while using the crisis to justify an accelerated transition to domestic nuclear and onshore wind generation, attempting to permanently exit the fossil fuel market. A catastrophic supply shock forces a prioritization of immediate economic relief over long-term environmental and market frameworks, as seen in the emergency suspension of carbon costs and pricing mechanics. The ultimate determinant of global liquidity now rests within the United States Federal Reserve. Central banks find themselves cornered by a stagflationary dilemma. A supply shock drives consumer prices rapidly upward, while the sheer cost of energy crushes consumer demand and stalls industrial output. In March 2026, the Federal Reserve defied intense political pressure and held the benchmark short-term interest rate steady at a restrictive 3.6%. The mechanics of the Fed's trap are clear. If they cut interest rates prematurely to stimulate the labor market, they risk unanchoring inflation expectations, depreciating the dollar, and legitimizing a secondary wave of price increases. But if they maintain restrictive borrowing rates, while $4 a gallon gasoline erodes household purchasing power, they guarantee a sharp contraction in consumer spending. Exogenous physical blockades neutralize standard monetary tools. The Fed's paralysis forces emerging markets to maintain painfully high domestic interest rates to defend their currencies, compounding the debt crisis across the developing world. The ultimate macroeconomic outcome hinges on what analysts call the economic clock of war, the operational duration of the Strait of Hormuz blockade. This chart maps the temporal threshold of the crisis. A brief closure allows advanced economies to bridge the supply gap with strategic reserves, resulting in a transitional inflation spike followed by a soft landing. A prolonged closure, however, forces a severe deviation in global growth trajectories. Following the downward path, a sustained Brent crude price in excess of $110 per barrel acts as a massive, regressive consumption tax. Households are forced to allocate vastly higher percentages of their disposable income toward basic transportation and hyperinflated food costs. In advanced Western economies, where consumer spending dictates GDP, this rapid demand destruction translates directly into corporate earnings contractions, suspended capital expenditures, and mass layoffs. Across the global South, highly indebted nations face an insurmountable triad of pressures: a severe energy price shock, a devastating fertilizer deficit, and a strong US dollar forcing massive local currency depreciation. The concentration of critical hydrocarbons at a single maritime chokepoint remains an unmitigated risk to financial stability. Unless trade is restored through the Strait of Hormuz, the resulting combination of high energy costs and reduced consumer spending creates the conditions for a synchronous global recession.